Welcome to The Progressive American. My name is Connor Kelly, a freelance writer, political commentator, and most of all, the proud host of this bi-weekly podcast. Here I discuss the nation's news from a progressive perspective with new, informed guests on every show. Today I will be going over the FBI search of Trump's home, Biden's student loan forgiveness plans, and Ben Shapiro's lies about it, as well as Biden's recent speech against the MAGA Republicans in Philadelphia. Plus, I will be going over the rising tide of Christian nationalism in America with political YouTuber and video essayist NateTalksToYou. After the long hiatus, I really have to say I'm glad to be back, and I look forward to discussing these things with you in more detail. With that out of the way, let's get into the news. Earlier last month, the FBI took the unprecedented and shocking move of searching former President Donald Trump's home at Mar-A-Lago, looking and finding multiple sensitive documents, with some of them being top secret, the highest classification for government documents. The Washington Post reported in an exclusive that some of the documents that the FBI was looking for were related to nuclear weapons. Now, they didn't report whether or not the documents involved American nuclear capabilities or American intelligence on other powers and their weapons, but the idea that this could even be a serious possibility is insane. According to the Department of Justice, the raid obtained more than 100 sensitive documents, none of which belonged to the former president. And of course, the consequences pop up, and of course, Trump has done all that he can to slow the investigation down, and he has made a litany of claims against the investigation, arguing that it is politically motivated and such. Trump has gone so far as to file for a special master to review the documents that the FBI seized from him. His lawyers argue that it is to protect the documents held by Trump under executive privilege. It's worth noting whether or not a former president can act upon executive privilege anymore is a matter of serious debate. However, it is incredibly unlikely that Trump would win on that regard, considering his previous abuses of the term executive privilege. And even before he initiated his claims of executive privilege, Trump demanded that the affidavit that established a basis for the FBI search to be released to the public. But when that document was released and the affidavit was shown to the public, it showed that the FBI suspected that Donald Trump was improperly handling sensitive documents which involved national defense information, and he refused to adequately secure them. And even worse for Trump was the allegation within that same affidavit that Donald Trump may have violated Section E of the Espionage Act by virtue of him illegally taking those documents and holding them at Mar-A-Lago. Of course, now this brings up the issue of whether or not Trump will be indicted, and many of Trump's allies have been repulsed by the idea, as to be expected. But Senator Lindsey Graham took it a step further, arguing that if Trump was indicted, American people would riot in the streets.
If there's a prosecution of Donald Trump for mishandling classified information after the Clinton debacle, which you presided over and did a hell of a good job, there'll be riots in the streets.
Now, those rather uncouth comments came from Lindsey Graham when he was on Fox News. He probably felt he was safe to say those things. But when it comes to what that actually implies about how Lindsey Graham sees this case, as a United States Senator no less, it really goes to show that he doesn't seem to realize the gravity of his own corruption. He has no idea about the full extent of the FBI's evidence because they've only released the affidavit because it's an ongoing investigation. And yet he's perfectly willing to engage with political violence as a possibility, as a reaction to Donald Trump's behavior. Now, he'll inevitably argue, well, I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying that riots in the street are acceptable. I'm just saying this is what's going to happen, and it's the practical implications of the FBI's actions. And I gotta say, that's a load of crap. We have seen time and time again that Republicans, particularly MAGA Republicans, are perfectly willing to engage in political violence to achieve their desired outcomes. And now that the former president, their guy, is being possibly charged for illegally stealing from the American public and putting American national security at risk, now a United States senator is basically using the threat of a mob to achieve his desired goals. And that goal, for the record, is the eternal protection of one man, Donald J. Trump. Now, I'd like you to imagine for a moment if a man you never met or never knew, demanded that you defend them from the FBI and law enforcement, and that they were out to get that person, and that they needed your help, that the law is going to destroy them, and that they are the last line of defense for your rights, what would you say? Chances are you'd tell them to pound sand. You don't know that person. Yes, you know their names and you can look at their platforms, but truth be told, none of us know who these people are on a personal level. I have met President Biden, I have met Vice President Harris and Senator Warren, but that doesn't mean I know their true character. They are politicians. They have an agenda. And Trump almost certainly has an agenda in everything he does. It's just they're not bound by the same rules as the people I mentioned are. Donald Trump, when he interacts with the law, he uses an entire cacophony of lies to defend himself, no matter the infraction. And yet, people like Lindsey Graham are perfectly willing to accept these lies or engage with them or play defense for them, because it's easier to pretend to have principles than it is to actually deal with the consequences of having those principles. Whether Lindsey Graham or any other GOP operative likes it, the rule of law supersedes everyone. Not just Hillary, not just Trump, not just me, everybody. It applies to every single American, every single public office holder, no matter what. And you can go and try and point to Hillary all you like. I don't really like her, so it doesn't really matter. What matters right now is Donald Trump is the one under investigation. Donald Trump is the one being asked to testify. Donald Trump is the one who actually has to provide the transparency this time. And unlike Hillary, I doubt he's going to testify for nearly 11 hours before any sort of committee. That's just not what he does. Donald Trump obfuscates, he'll hide, he'll play games, he'll create conspiracy theories, and he'll have panic attacks like he did on his Truth Social website, where he began making a bunch of comments, like 60 different posts within like an hour. This isn't somebody who with a big grand political strategy who understands the rule of law. No, this is a belligerent child being defended by enablers. And it's criminal behavior that threaten the security of our nation. So I don't know if Trump's going to run in 2024. I don't know if there's ever going to be any serious conviction against Donald Trump. But where I stand on this is that the Republican Party and how they conduct themselves today shows themselves to be completely beholden, not to the people they claim to represent, but to one man, a man who does not care about this country, who does not care about the people who help him put their lives and well-being on the line for him. He only cares about himself. And the Republican Party knows that. The leadership of the Republican Party knows that. But they're willing to let him get away with it anyway. In less corrupt news, the Biden administration has surprised the nation and many progressive advocates around the country, canceling up to $20,000 of student loan debt for people with incomes under $60,000, along with $10,000 for those above that level if they so want it. In reaction, Republicans are complaining about the decision and are arguing that it is unfair. In a recent episode of his podcast, Ben Shapiro made a similar argument, pointing to previous generations of people who paid off their student loans.
Joe Biden was asked yesterday, how is it fair for people who never went to college to subsidize those who did? How is it fair for people who paid off their student debt to subsidize people who did not pay off their student debt? How is that fair? I mean, by the way, you could ask this question about people who don't pay off their credit card debt. Why doesn't he just cancel all credit card debt? After all, money magically grows on trees. And as we know, the fairest thing is for you to take out irresponsible debt and then for your neighbor to pay it.
Is this unfair to people who paid their student loans or chose not to take out loans?
Is it fair to people who, in fact, do not own multi-billion-dollar businesses? They see why these guys get them all at tax rates? Is that fair?
Is it fair that some ostriches can't fly? Is it fair that iguanas freeze and fall out of the trees in wintertime in Florida? Is that fair? What's fair, man? What's fair?
He's asked a very specific question. Why is it fair for people who paid off their loans to now pay everybody else's loans? And his answer is multi-billion-dollar businesses or some such nonsense. The hell does that have to do with the price of tea in China? What are you even talking about, dude?
Now, crappy impressions aside, Ben Shapiro is intentionally missing the point. Firstly, Biden is not saying that just because corporations exist, there is a justification for what Ben Shapiro would consider an unjust system. What he's talking about is how much money we are willing to give to subsidize corporations who are doing even worse behavior, if not outright not deserving the money in the first place. But that's neither here nor there. What we're actually talking about is whether or not it is fair to forgive debt when others have paid off that same debt. And now whenever I hear somebody talk about this, I have two questions for them. First, how is someone being forced to take on massive debt just to get an education fair? If you want someone to improve their well-being in life, their lot in life, to get skills that make them valuable to the community, then college is probably going to be a part of that for a lot of people. But because we have neglected to do anything about that ridiculous price of education, we are now left with an unmitigated burden that should have been addressed decades ago. Also, how is it fair that the generations who are complaining about student loan forgiveness had to pay less than those who pay for education today? When Ben Shapiro went to college in 2004, the cost of private education was roughly $27,000, and at that same time, a public college costed around $11,000, $15,000 in today's money. By 2018, that cost went up to $21,000 for public education and up to nearly $50,000 for a private school. And it hasn't stopped there. CNBC reports that over 1 million student loan borrowers default on their payments every single year, and even more are estimated to default. One report by the Brookings Institute estimates that nearly 40% of student loan borrowers will default in 2023. The answer to Ben's question is that the burden is significantly higher than when it was when previous generations were paying off their debt. Student loan forgiveness is fair because the debt standards that Americans are now facing are significantly more burdensome on students than it was before. The situation has changed. There are people who don't have the luxury or support that Ben has or that many well-off people have, and they need help. And I know that Ben will argue, and did argue in this clip, that people shouldn't take out student loans if they can't pay them off. But most people who get loans don't plan to avoid them. They do it because it's necessary to get an education above a GED. But the price of education is so ridiculously high that there are too many people who will fall through even though they planned to work and get a good job that would help them pay off those loans. So Ben, when you ask why this is fair, it is because that the entire situation and the cost to go to school is an injustice, not the debt relief. If you or anyone else wants to talk about what to do about student loan debt or the price of college and how to reduce it, by all means, provide some solutions. But considering you talk about student loan debt only when it comes up with being forgiven or any sort of policy that would try to relieve the debt, I highly doubt you are actually interested in any real solutions. You're looking for people to punish because they fit a stereotype in your mind. In more bombastic news, the Biden administration has been hitting back at the GOP recently, giving firm and fiery speeches arguing that the Republican Party as it stands is a threat to democracy. In one incident, he referred to the MAGA movement as being, quote, semi-fascist. But on Thursday this week, Biden outdid himself, giving a stern warning to the nation that the MAGA movement was no longer interested in the norms of the country and was a threat to the republic itself. He argued that America could still be saved from the MAGA movement, but that the truth mattered and their conspiratorial rhetoric still remained a threat. In his speech, Biden pointed this out directly, calling out the fealty that Republican leadership and voters have had to Trump, saying, quote, history tells us that blind loyalty to a single leader and a willingness to engage in political violence is fatal to democracy, unquote. But most of all, he hit back on the idea of Republicans being able to make up ridiculous claims of fraud with nothing to back it up and making policies that restrict the right to vote. He pointed at their position not only as a threat to the republic, but to the rights of all citizens.
Claims of fraud. I will not stand by and watch elections in this country stolen by people who simply refuse to accept that they lost. I will not stand by and watch the most fundamental freedom in this country, the freedom to vote, and have your vote counted and be taken from you and the American people. Look, as your president, I will defend our democracy with every fiber of my being, and I'm asking every American to join me.
Of course, Republicans are not happy with him. Lauren Boebert, representative from Colorado, tweeted, quote, I don't want a lecture. I want an apology, unquote. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas tweeted, tonight Joe Biden vilified millions of Americans in a divisive and angry speech that was detached from the reality of his political failures. He isn't actually interested in restoring the soul of the nation. He's only interested in pitting his fellow Americans against one another, unquote. Now, I'd wonder where this attitude was during the 4 years of Trump's presidency, but I'm guessing that kind of rhetoric would have destroyed his career. Nonetheless, my answer for these two people is one that I think a lot of people will feel very strongly, and that is to tell both of them to go pound sand. Yes, not all Republicans are fascists, but Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene almost certainly are. Lauren Boebert was one of over 100 members of the House of Representatives who voted to try and overturn the election, an election that saw some of the highest voter turnout in decades. Marjorie Taylor Greene called for the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, to be executed for treason, and yet Republican leadership will do nothing about her. She has even associated with a well-known neo-Nazi and fascist, Nick Fuentes, who is a Holocaust denier. Greene attended and was a central guest of his America First Political Action Committee, which opposes interracial marriage, gay rights, and hates Jewish people. And she is one of the Republicans' best fundraisers. So yes, there is a fascist element within the Republican Party, and it's not being addressed enough. So if it takes more speeches like this, even if it annoys Republicans and causes a bit of division to do it, I will happily endure those speeches because it means they're actually talking about the problems within the Republican Party. You cannot have one of your major fundraisers for 2021 be a literal associate of a Nazi. You cannot have your entire media apparatus surround yourself with conspiracy theories, fealty to one man in a cult of personality, and expect somebody to say, oh, that's not fascism, that has nothing to do with authoritarian right-wing ideology. No, people notice patterns, and we've been noticing them since 2016, since Charlottesville, and since Donald Trump played up all these lies about winning the election when he knew he didn't. And as you'll see in my interview after the break, there is something about this that is not being talked about enough, and that is the Christian theocratic nationalism. The element of the right which uses Christianity and the word of God as a mechanism to say, we decide what's moral in America. We get to push our religion onto government. We get to determine what institutions are legitimate or not. And the truth is, they will never ever abandon that so long as it keeps working for them. So yes, I know that Biden is not the favorite for a lot of people. I understand that for some people, having somebody, a president even, talking about fascism within a party that you are a part of can be offensive. But that's kind of the point. If you're offended by the label of fascist, maybe you should take a look at the party and see, hey, maybe there's some weird fascist stuff in it. Because you've got people like Gavin McInnes, Nick Fuentes, always looking for a way into the party, and thus far, they've got at least one door in, if not many more. It is incumbent on the Republicans, not the Democrats, to deal with the fascist element within their party, because as it stands right now, the Democrats don't have one. Instead, Republicans continue to play these games and hide behind their so-called appeal to freedom, but they haven't had a platform since 2016. They have nothing but their hatred of Democrats, liberals, and the institutions that restrain them. And so long as that remains the case, they will continue to fit the bill of being fascists. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have a quick break but don't go anywhere. Up next is my interview with YouTuber, political essayist, and liberal critic of religious fundamentalism, Nate Talks to You. Stick around. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Progressive American podcast. I'm sitting here with YouTuber and video essayist Nate Talks to You. I'd like to first thank him for joining me today. We had some scheduling issues, but I was finally able to get him on the show, both for my issues and just in general trying to get to talk to somebody who I know will really enjoy this topic. So to start off with the topic of Christian nationalism, I was wondering if we could first start off with your first experiences with it, since you and I come from very different backgrounds when it comes to our relationship with religion.
Yeah, sure. And by the way, again, thank you, Connor, for having me on the show. So I was raised Methodist Christian, and I remember, since maybe elementary school and onward, going to church every Sunday. But then maybe around middle school, I ceased my regular attendance to church. But I don't recall Christian nationalism ever really being a phenomenon I personally experienced growing up. I guess my first introduction to Christian nationalism was more so via the media, especially the internet and news coverage on television. I remember watching documentaries like Jesus Camp, and you saw this vehement adherence to Christianity and Christian nationalism, and then just from there, witnessing these different examples of it throughout the media. But that's about the extent of it. But now I'm seeing like it become far, far more visible, especially after the election of Trump and onward now.
Yeah, and I will say, like, growing up, I grew up Roman Catholic, and I still am a Roman Catholic. Although there are some who would argue that I'm heretical in a lot of things.
I've seen that stuff online from you. Yeah, you got a lot of angry chatters.
Oh yeah. It's been an interesting time. But what I've kind of dealt with on my end is growing up with Christianity and really the discussion surrounding, the founders. It almost seems like there's been a deification. I remember there's actually in my home back up north, there is a picture in my room that I remember getting as a kid with George Washington praying at Valley Forge. And obviously that's a very, I wouldn't say theocratic approach, but there's definitely this element of connecting the idea of America's creation with a divine influence. And recently, we've had individuals like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene specifically calling out the idea that the government is supposed to remain neutral in issues of religion. And considering you've been not only dealing with, on your channel, Christian fundamentalists, but other religious extremists and criticizing them, what do you think would be like what makes like Christian nationalists like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert so unique from some of the extremists you've dealt with?
Well, that's the thing about it is that I personally do not view MTG and Lauren Boebert as being a very unique phenomenon. The video I wanted to like have you play potentially on here. There's a video that was put out by I forget the name right now. It's this one like progressive organization, but they have this compilation of different politicians speaking in the 80s and 90s at GOP conventions. And a lot of what they're saying in these clips mirrors the exact same kind of rhetoric that we would see from the likes of, again, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And of course, like, you have clips like people like Patrick Buchanan talking about like the culture war and how we need to like, take back the country. Now, thankfully, a lot of their efforts back in the 90s were unsuccessful. But of course, these people, even though they were failing back then, that doesn't mean they went away. They just got quiet for a while. But from what I can tell, 2015 especially was a real turning point in this country. I think that with the legalization of gay marriage, that was like really like the call to the conservatives, especially the Christian conservatives in this country, that times were changing and the country that they envisioned was disappearing from their grasp. And then I think that was part of what motivated people to go out there and elect Donald Trump. This guy who spoke to them directly and used rhetoric which was appealing to them. And he was the most promising figure to take back the country which they envisioned. I mean, his message was make America great again. Well, again, referring to what time period?
Yeah, and it's the vagueness of the terminology that makes it easier to sell. But I would also say that like part of the thing that I've noticed is there's this almost palingenetic ultranationalism that influences the way that a lot of these Christian nationalists talk about what they want to see in American government. And to clarify, when I say Christian nationalists, for those who are listening, I'm referring specifically to Christians who seek to enforce Christian theocratic laws, principles in government at the expense of the free exercise clause and establishment clauses of the First Amendment. They believe that God's rules and laws should be enforced in government, even if it is harmful to the free exercise of other people's religions. But I would say, as much as like, yes, there is this common thread of the old discussions about the culture war are like very similar. It's very strange to me that, you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene specifically embracing the term Christian nationalist when, a couple years ago, if you said that out loud, it would be a massive, there would be a backlash against you. But now it seems to me that there's this radicalism within the Republican Party specifically that seems to believe that they can get away with it or embrace the controversy in a manner that they can control.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of that comes down to this emboldenment of these people, thanks to some of the more firebrand rhetoric of Trump. Like people were not used to people speaking in this manner for a very long time in this country, and I think that thanks to the way that people like Trump were speaking up on stage, this kind of broke down those barriers, made people feel like, hey, obviously this is resonating with people. Maybe more of these politicians should begin speaking this way if they want to become successful. And I'm not exactly sure how it began, who was the first one to, initiate this trend. But you see a lot of these evangelicals talking about Trump as though he's been ordained by God himself to run the country, to bring our country back. And again, I'm not sure where that comes from originally, but it was a trend that was going on since his election. And then I think... Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing. We can talk about this more in depth later on, but there's also the whole conspiratorial nature of QAnon and the religious undertones to that. But we'll talk about that more in depth later.
Yeah, and now that I think about it, I'm also kind of reminded of Michelle Bachmann and how her comments about the end times and how the world is going to end soon, and how that kind of influence plays into those themes of conspiracism. But I really find this whole thing odd, not just in terms of obviously the risk to free exercise of religion, the dangers of imposing religious law on one of the largest republics in the world, but also in terms of what that means for dehumanization, how that contributes to big prejudices against people who don't conform to their understanding of nationalism and Christianity. And I was wondering, do you think that some of this is not just a religious fervor, but an element of ethnic and racial prejudice? Because it seems to me that a lot of the discussion surrounding what is acceptable form of Christianity doesn't include Black liberation theology. It doesn't go into, the social gospel, which was an influence for Christians through the New Deal. It seems to me there is an element of class and race that is trying to be erased by this nationalist fervor.
Oh, there is undeniably a racial element to this entire thing. I mean, from all the polling that I've seen about who was voting for Donald Trump, these were by and large white Protestants. These were not Black Protestants at all. So there was definitely an overlap between being white and being religious and being a man. These things all go in tandem. But in addition to that, the racial element became very much apparent in terms of who was attending the January 6th insurrection. I'm trying to find, I have a link to it around here somewhere, but it found that a lot of the people who were involved in Jan 6 were people not from what you would expect, not from red states, but rather these were conservatives who were living in blue states, especially ones that are becoming less and less white. You had more Black people, more Hispanics coming into the area, and these people felt as though the country which they had grown up with expecting it to be, which was a white country, they felt it was being taken away from them. And that was one of the incentives for going there, because they felt that Trump was the solution to what they perceived as being a problem.
Yeah, and that's where it's kind of odd to me, and I know I keep saying it's odd because it really doesn't make sense to me in terms of what that actually is practical for government. But it's really interesting to see that even though, you would expect people from red states to be involved in that kind of reaction, a lot of it is Republicans who, like you said, are afraid of losing their way or losing what they see as the traditional America, seemingly forgetting that, in the 19th century, Catholics, for example, were not considered part of the American experience. For example, in 1844 in Philadelphia, there was a nativist riot, and they specifically targeted Irish Catholics at the time. And all the way until the 1930s, if I'm not mistaken, the Klan specifically targeted Jewish people, Black people, and Catholics. So this idea of who counts as a true Christian, who counts as part of the American experience, is also strangely ahistorical. You would think that a movement that claims to represent the traditions of the United States would actually be familiar with how those traditions changed.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing about it, is that the more you look through history, the more you realize that we're just like living through repetition over and over again. Well, just like you were mentioning before, yeah, back in the 1800s, America was a majority Protestant country, and people felt as though, you can see like even like the propaganda artwork. If you look online, the propaganda artwork from the 1800s, people felt as though like, the Catholics are going to like be controlled by the Pope, and they're going to vote their own way and whatnot. So yeah, we just see that the same thing happened when it comes to Muslim immigrants to America, with Mexican immigrants to America. It's always a new scapegoat, a new threat to the country. And I think a lot of this plays into a certain mentality, and that being a conservative mentality, where any kind of change, there's even like research done on this, that people who are conservative tend to perceive any kind of change to the status quo as being like an innate threat. And I'm not exactly sure how you undo that kind of thought process, but I think that it is one of the motivating factors for what we're seeing happen today.
And to kind of hit on that note, I'd also like to kind of turn towards the way that they've talked about America's Constitution and how they've kind of changed or tried to change the way we think about the political system in terms of our relationship with the First Amendment. I'm sure you saw the clip of Lauren Boebert where she was talking about the idea of the separation of church and state. And she basically made the point that there is no such thing as a separation of church and state, that the term appears in a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. But what's strange about how they talk about that letter is how both Madison and Jefferson were concerned with the idea of the government, particularly the federal government, getting involved in religion. Madison famously took Patrick Henry to town over that in his time in the legislature. But I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this shift in terms of like changing the narrative around the First Amendment, and what can be done to kind of make sure people understand that the reason the First Amendment exists in the first place is to prevent this kind of theocratic authoritarianism?
Well, that's the thing about it. I think when it comes to the likes of Lauren Boebert and MTG, these are not people who, I mean, like if you look at their entire record, these are people that clearly do not feel like they have any obligation to conform to the truth. These are people who will do and say whatever they can to further their own political power. And if that just means, like writing up their own historical fiction about like the origin of this country, they'll do it. These are people who believe that they are guided by God himself to make the country into his own image. These are people who feel that, hey, if the Bible is meant to be the absolute truth, then why should our country and our laws not reflect that truth? So at the end of the day, I don't think that it's really much of a question of like how accurate their claims are. It's just more of like acknowledging these are people that really don't care either way. They're going to have it even if they are wrong.
Yeah, and I get that, and I saw that you sent me the research numbers on the amount of people who attended January 6th and the demographics there, and this kind of hits onto your point as well with the racial and ethnic element of it. Just according to this one, it says the protesters were 95% white and 85% male. Many of them were living near Biden supporters in blue and purple counties. So it kind of does play into this idea of nationalists wanting to use the image of God or believing that they are driven by God to preserve their country when they are surrounded by people that they deem separate from that tradition. Mm-hmm. But in terms of, to kind of segue towards the political consequences of it, in terms of the midterms, we have seen recently some improvement in terms of the polling for the Democrats, particularly in the Senate. The House is a bit iffier. And we've started to see a lot of more radical conspiratorial candidates that are really pushing the idea of election denialism and how, if you don't defend the Constitution as they see it, particularly with their theocratic tendencies, you need to be taken care of. We've seen multiple comments about violence, both online and by some candidates. I will link them in the video description afterwards. But it seems now that there is not just an ideological problem, but a complete rejection of political norms and the removal of violence as an option is gone. There are members who genuinely believe violence is an acceptable solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at the end of the day, these are people that do not value democracy, because again, like, these are people that believe that it is God's will that they take over the country. It is God's will that they make the laws reflect their ideology. So if that means just making up bullshit about elections being staged to further that goal, then so be it.
And that kind of ties into the QAnon thing that you mentioned earlier. Particularly, I think one of the things that I've noticed is the rehashing of anti-Semitic tropes as well, like the underlying idea of the blood libel, the preying on children when it comes to LGBTQ people. These ideas aren't just, about, oh, we believe God is guiding us to govern this way. We believe that our enemies are pedophiles, are satanic. And I was wondering, when it comes to how social media companies like Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, etc., how do we require these companies to really take that stuff seriously, and B, how do we make sure that even when this content is removed, it doesn't like stream into the mainstream of public life if it hasn't already?
Well, yeah, I have quite a bit to say about that. So a couple things to bring up first. I want to say there's little to no value in meaningfully engaging with these allegations. As somebody who actually used to be a conspiracy theorist myself back when I was a teenager, I remember like being in the fold and like seeing the way these people operate. It does not matter how many times you debunk their allegations, whether it be about 9/11 or any other kind of conspiracy theory. These are people who will dig in their heels, call you a shill, call you a sheep or whatever. So I just know from a lot of experience that these are people who are not willing to have their mind changed. So I think that your best bet is that when these people pop up, they should absolutely just be taken off these platforms. And that way you minimize the ability for their ideas to spread any further. Now, as for how to actually get platforms like Facebook, like Twitter, to take it seriously, that's the more difficult part, because some of these companies may view it as profitable to keep them on the platform. So I would just say your best bet is to make as much noise as possible about the necessity of getting them off the platform. And I think that in terms of the alt-right, I mean, you look at people like Stefan Molyneux, David Duke, I think that a lot of the frustration that people had with these figures was what ended up getting a lot of them banned around, let's say, 2019, 2020. So if you want to get rid of them, you have to make it clear that you're not going to be quiet about it. And hopefully these platforms will respond.
And I remember how much people went to town on Alex Jones, and particularly after the Sandy Hook incident, and how he basically had to face, civil penalties for his actions, and he's still on fighting them tooth and nail. But that also kind of suggests that, it's got to be targeted. It's not just, we want them to ban, say, Christian nationalists who engage in QAnon conspiracy theories. We need you to ban these particular ones because they're the worst, the worst contributors to it. But that does kind of beg the question of how we organize around that, because on the one hand, you and I were discussing this from a perspective of commentary, but a lot of the noise and backlash sometimes has to be coordinated, otherwise it wanes. We live, unfortunately, in a media cycle that is very short term, like a story about, say, Trump allegedly like taking nuclear secrets and having them at Mar-a-Lago will be big story for 2 days, and then we'll be waiting to see anything else from the headlines. I guess what my question in that case is, how do we organize enough to, keep the headlines on these individuals, keep them from fading away and being able to sneak back into, the good graces of these companies?
That's the thing about it, is that when you look at a lot of these controversial figures who are thankfully now banned, they were able to fly under the radar for a very long time because they are more niche characters on the internet. However, it seems like whenever a public figure gets popular enough and they kind of begin to bleed into the mainstream, then that's when you begin to see the backlash finally build up. Like Alex Jones was around for decades until he finally got banned from social media, and that's because he eventually became so visible that people finally felt the necessity of getting him off the platform. So I think that in terms of getting people to be deplatformed sooner, it just requires having connections with the right people who are able to create as much noise as possible. So, for example, on your end, you're in journalism. So if you have contacts to people who are larger players in the journalism field, get them to write articles, make their names more noticeable to people who care about these issues, and then from there you can have like a snowball effect to begin to generate with other people who are also journalists covering the same thing. And then you can also have people who are in television, who are on YouTube like myself, begin to cover these figures, and then hopefully it builds up enough to the point where we finally get these platforms to react. And part of that also involves one more thing I wanted to mention.
Yeah, go right ahead.
It isn't enough for us to say these people are bad. I think that whenever we cover these people, be it in videos or articles, we need to have a call to action that these people need to go. Without that call to action, it's like the platform is like, there's no initiative to do anything beyond just saying they're bad.
Yeah, and I would say that unfortunately a lot of commentary, and this is just a generalization on my part, does kind of imitate this idea of putting a label on somebody, but doesn't actually explain why the label itself is a bad thing. And I think that's kind of what's going on with Christian nationalism. We say, oh, this person's a Christian nationalist, they're extreme, but we don't explain like, hey, if you enforce religious laws in government, you are going to have an incident where people are going to lose their ability to freely practice their religion. And to just give an example, since I'm Catholic, Marjorie Taylor Greene has referred to the Catholic Church as satanic, as supported by Satan. And she said this to the Church Militant, one of the most extreme versions of Catholic organizations out there. And that kind of commentary, I think, does really raise the question: what type of Christianity do you want to see enforced in government? How do you expect to really protect the First Amendment if you do? And if you can't find a way to do that, why should anybody take you seriously? And I think those questions, like on CNN and all over the place, should just be asked over and over and over again. But on the other hand, I also think we need to seriously talk about what they're actually proposing to do, not just in terms of like saying they're enforcing religion in government. For example, Lauren Boebert, and I know I'm coming back to these two figures, I'll get to Vincent James in a bit, said that maybe we should have biblical citizenship tests in schools. And that to me needs to be put everywhere. I'm wondering how effective you think that might be, but for me, I think it's just showing the public who these people really are, and not just talking about it in terms of right versus left. It's a matter of they're a threat to the republic.
That is a good point. Yeah, I think that it's always important to package these people in a way, like when presenting them to like a larger audience, make it abundantly clear that it isn't just a threat to people who are Democrats, who are left wing. It's a threat to Americans in general. Because if you make it a partisan issue, then you're going to lose a whole chunk of the American population, which makes it harder to actually react to these problems. But yeah, I think that organizations like Right Wing Watch, for example, have done a very, very good job at documenting all of this behavior, like people like Vincent James, who, by the way, is, I'm sure as you already know, a white nationalist who's worked with the likes of Nick Fuentes. So these people are absolutely a threat, and it's shameful that there are so many politicians who are willing to work alongside him.
Well, and I am very, very frustrated with people like Nick Fuentes, in part because not only are they white nationalists, racists, like literal Nazis and Holocaust deniers, but also because they they use Catholicism, like, because Nick Fuentes calls himself a Catholic, and they will use the norms that they see as being part of Catholic theology as a justification for rejecting democratic governance. In particular, he has been very firm about being anti-LGBTQ and society as being degenerate. And that narrative is particularly frustrating just because it's intentionally built to delegitimize society as we know it, but also to convince people who have not yet gotten over their prejudices, who otherwise would not be fascistic, to kind of give an ear to an outright fascist.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that it was a great decision by a lot of social media to deplatform Nick Fuentes, because obviously he was growing, especially on Twitter. But unfortunately, it does seem as though like his current platform, Cozy, as you know, has been able to maintain itself for quite a while. But that's the thing, is that you unfortunately cannot prevent these people from being on every single platform. But like the less they're on, the harder it will be for them to promulgate their ideas.
Yeah, and that's where I'm kind of concerned about the deplatforming having limitations. I mean, Alex Jones, despite him like being banned from pretty much everything, he still makes a decent amount of money off of his work. And Nick Fuentes still consistently makes money, even though like CPAC won't let him in because they know he's too politically toxic to be tolerated. But then you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene, who attends one of his rallies, and he's back in the public eye, and he has a congresswoman legitimizing him. And I think another person also commented a while back something to the effect of like it being a cancer, but not actually removing it. That would be one of the chatters right now.
I didn't even know that we had a live chat. Where can I find that? Is that on YouTube or?
It's in the stream. You can look on stream in the app.
Oh, all right then.
Yeah, you can see it on Twitch as well. But yeah, I do sometimes wonder when say deplatforming becomes like doesn't 100% work on somebody, what is the next course of action? Because education is obviously a part of it, but making sure like they don't reach vulnerable people should also be a part. And I'm not quite sure where to go from here when deplatforming seems to be the default position.
Well, that's the unfortunate thing about it, is that like you can only, beggars can't be choosers, right? You can only like use so many avenues that are available to yourself. Once you've deplatformed a person from basically all, are we still available? Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Once you deplatform a person from like all mainstream social media, if they still have some kind of website which they're still operating on, at that point, the next step is to try to disconnect them from any kind of payment processor and try to get their service providers to disconnect from them. I'm not sure if you've been following it, but recently the website Kiwi Farms, it's this harassment and stalking forum, has been getting a lot of pushback for, again, being a harassment and stalking forum. And it does seem as though, like, the amount of pressure being levied against their service providers has been able to pay off. So I think whenever it comes to any other like figures in a similar nature to Kiwi Farms, the same thing should be done to them as well.
Yeah, and I think I one of the chatters mentioned it. Keffels, who is a trans activist and streamer, was swatted by a lot of these far right Christian nationalists, anti-trans activists, and a lot of the information that ended up like being posted was posted on Kiwi Farms. And it seems to me that for once we're actually seeing an attempt to use social media not just as like an educational tool, but as a means of organizing people to a call to action. Mm-hmm. But then again, I'm also seeing I don't know if you're familiar with this organization. There's an organization by the name of Awake Illinois. They are based out of my hometown, and they have been spreading like wildfire in terms of the amount of chapters they've been building up. And they play heavily on the groomer narrative and, this idea of societal degeneracy, which, as we mentioned earlier, leans into this idea of, the only legitimate society is a particular form of Christian authoritarianism. So on the other hand, I'm just sitting here like, why not? There seems to be also a battle that just not just online, but also in confronting these people in city council meetings, organizing counter organizations, putting money and support and resources towards that. And I was wondering, how can we like get social, like a lot of the people like Keffels, like ourselves, to really organize around a cohesive ground movement to kind of combat these organizations?
Well, I think the first thing you want to do is make it abundantly clear to everybody that these organizations are indeed a threat to society. So if you can ever like sneak people into whatever meetings they're holding and get damning audio of the comments they're making and the nature of what they're trying to create, that is a great starting point for trying to get these people shut down. And then once you have all the evidence you need, then you can begin distributing it far and wide on social media and try to directly contact people with large platforms to go and distribute your message on your behalf. And hopefully from there, you can begin trying to get people within your own community who are part of any like political organizations that you belong to create rallies and call out these groups and say, hey, these people should not be part of political conversation because of the threat they pose. And I mean, it's a very convoluted process, but that's like the gist of what should be done to resolve that issue.
Yeah, and there was something quite similar in my hometown involving the founder of Awake Illinois, Shannon Adcock. She was going to be appointed to a government position involving cultural heritage, and considering she's also big on this anti-CRT panic, there was a concerted effort by activists that I know, particularly Holly Hootman and several others, who basically went on a massive letter writing campaign, online media response, basically pressuring the city council not to put her in a position of power. And eventually it gained the attention of the Chicago Tribune and the Daily Herald, along with several others. And she was dropped. Now she's still, running to gain as much political influence as possible. She's interviewing Republican congressional candidates, and she's stumping for Darren Bailey, for example. So it does work. But I think there needs to be also a long-term plan to deal with that kind of nationalism. But I'd also like to switch gears a little bit. And I was kind of wondering your thoughts on how media outlets like PragerU play into this narrative. Because even though they might not be like explicitly fascistic, they do make videos, making the same point that Lauren Boebert did. And they are very, very successful. They're very large. They make very quick, easily digestible videos that are, they sound persuasive to the everyday person. And, streams like this, they're maybe going to be like an hour or 45 minutes or something like that, might not be as effective. So when it comes to countering that kind of narrative, what do you think is the most effective way for people like myself and like yourself to respond to those kinds of things?
That's the thing, is that PragerU, I mean, of course, PragerU is trash. If you've looked at any of their content, it is a lot of just like normal conservative talking points, anti-regulation of big business, all that sort of stuff. And not to mention a lot of like Christian nationalism bleeds into some of their content as well. But I think that they've moderated, at least like on the surface, their message enough, where I highly doubt that any mainstream social media would ever deplatform their content. So in terms of them, I think that your best bet is to create edutainment against them. And you see that there have been a lot of people in what you might call breadtube, quote unquote, who have made videos like video essays or live streams rebutting a lot of the arguments they put forward in their content. So I think the thing, like if there's a narrative out there, you need to provide a comprehensive counter narrative to whatever they're spouting. And I think that quite a few YouTubers have been effective in doing so when it comes to PragerU. But in addition to that, remember, like you should not limit yourself to only one avenue. I think that in addition to YouTube videos, you can create memes and you can mock these people. You can make them look absurd through different formats of meme nature. Along with that, you can write articles and you can rebut them through that outlet. You can try to get people who are actually part of television news to potentially talk about them. And I'm trying to think. Oh, one thing I wanted to point out as well is that even if somebody is your enemy, that does not mean that there are not tactics they've been utilizing that you can't learn from. So one thing that I recall seeing Nick Fuentes utilize when he was having a thing called the Groyper Wars against Charlie Kirk is he would have people from his own group go to Kirk's events and ask a bunch of gotcha questions to Charlie Kirk to throw them off guard. And it was very effective, making Kirk and his organizations look quite foolish. So I think that if progressives could do a similar thing with whatever events are being hosted by PragerU and have people go up there with our own types of questions, that would be an effective way of making people like Prager look foolish. And always make sure that you have cameras with you and on you so you have your own version of the story.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what's been happening in the past when people, have confronted other people. Like I know Steven Crowder, when he's not prepared, particularly the Sam Cedar incident is an example of that. He doesn't do as well. He does not have as good of script. He can't do something off the cuff, and it looks bad. But when he's say talking to a college student on their way to class, who at their 8 a.m. class or something, it's a lot easier for him to control the narrative. So I think I agree 100% that there is an element of this that is about controlling the narrative, taking the initiative, and doing the groundwork. But in terms of, I guess this always goes back to money now, because PragerU is not just some YouTube; it's a heavily funded program that has a lot of networks and a lot of people coming on to support it. And that's where I think we sometimes find liberals, progressives, and even leftists lacking, is there doesn't seem to be this cohesive attempt to really organize around into a single organization to focus on specific targets. And to me, that seems like to be one of the biggest problems. It's the lack of resources. You can make a good YouTube video debunking PragerU step by step. Polydice, Sean, lots of others have done this. They make really good videos, but they might not have name recognition outside of the breadtube or traditional media sphere. And this is where I think the issue of media versus, say, electoral politics plays a role, because generally speaking, older people tend to vote more and are not as exposed to this. So the people who are actually voting on, for their candidates don't see the pushback. I'm wondering if you have any ideas on how to kind of go after that, but also to, connect with people who otherwise might be vulnerable to this kind of propaganda.
Well, I suppose some of this could be done directly with people. If you're if you have people who are maybe more religious or more conservative, within your own family, and you find them sharing PragerU content or similar content on social media, potentially reach out to them and try to explain to them on your own why this content is problematic in whatever way it might be. And hopefully you can sway them over, but at the end of the day, you may not be able to win everyone over. But along with that, if you feel as though the reach of YouTubers is limited, you can try to reach out to journalists and see if they could potentially jump in and do their own coverage, because of course there's far more legitimacy attached to being a journalist than there is to being a YouTuber, and that can also spread farther and wider than YouTube content typically can. So also take care of that avenue. But in addition to that, when it comes to video creation online, do not limit yourself to only one genre of content. When I see a lot of videos about PragerU, it is very long form content videos, which are 20 or so minutes long. It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of young people, especially, they don't have the attention span to watch a 20-minute long video. So take advantage of the 1 minute long format with platforms like TikTok or YouTube Shorts, and just find a single claim made by people like Dennis Prager, and then break down in 1 minute with a bunch of quippy remarks why that was bullshit.
Yeah, and I've noticed recently that's gotten a lot more popular. And I have my problems with TikTok, political TikTok especially, because a lot of it's short-natured, so it's not always going to be the most well-researched. But if you can balance that with also like providing additional sourcing and content while also being quick about it, I think that can be helpful. But to jump back into the conspiracism, because I think you really want to hit on this about the QAnon. It seems to me that the underlying theme of Christian nationalism is the decadence of society, that a society is horribly corrupt, the institutions are corrupt and cannot be trusted. And, obviously there's been a lot more corruption since Citizens United, but I also think that there's also this element of a lack of historical understanding. There were people during Lincoln's time who were like given positions to, vote the way that they wanted them to. And those positions, even though there's still some of that today, it seems to me we really don't emphasize how far America has changed in terms of its relationship with corruption. And I wonder what are your thoughts on how that contributes to QAnon and really a lot of the conspiracy theories about voter fraud and other things like that?
Well, that's the thing about it. I mean, it's bad enough when you have social media platforms allowing people like Alex Jones to exist, but I think it gets even worse when you have politicians out there who are more than happy to chime along and just play along with that type of argumentation. Because I know it's been talked about time and time again, but like no politician in history has ever lied at the frequency of Donald Trump. And he bred an environment where truth was completely irrelevant. You could lie literally thousands of times and people can call you out and ultimately nobody would care. And in that kind of environment, conspiracy theories are going to thrive. And that's exactly what we saw happen. But in regards to QAnon, to my knowledge, that kind of originated with Pizzagate. This whole argument that like Hillary Clinton's emails, if like you interpreted like different lines in a weird way, which it's like why did you have to reinterpret them? We'll just like take it at its face value. But they said like if you like found code words in there, it like alluded to a pedophile cult at a pizza shop. But I think that from there that kind of led into QAnon becoming a phenomenon, and people claiming that the Democratic Party was full of satanic pedophiles and that Trump was ordained by God to rescue America from the pedophiles. And then from there, we have this weird like underlying religious narrative play into it. So yeah, I think that a lot of these people feel compelled by that conspiracy theory to go out there and take down what they believe is the devil himself.
Yeah, and it's also kind of weird too, because when they talk about enforcing religion or the society being corrupt and decadent, being controlled by pedophiles, etc., it seems to me they seem to view the relationship between religion and government as not just being like interconnected, but necessary to preserve society itself. And what's strange about that is, from my perspective, mixing government and religion makes both worse, because the corruption of both institutions mixes. Like when you talk about, say, a lot of the problems with the Roman Catholic Church, particularly in its relationship with dealing with abusive priests, you do not want that organization to have political power in a mechanism that would prevent it from being held to account by the law. Similarly, you don't want the government to have control over what constitutes an acceptable religion, because if the majority wants to enforce a particular narrative of religious authority, they can basically throw the free exercise clause out the window. And like, even just how I said that there, that took a long time to explain. And so it's weird to me that there isn't a lot of quick remarks out there to like point out, hey, there's all these problems with this idea of Christianity and religion in general being interconnected to government.
Well, I think that if you look at the messaging by people like PragerU and Ben Shapiro, you see this constant message that what makes America successful at the end of the day is that we have quote unquote Judeo-Christian values. And the underlying message here is that the minute that America loses their Judeo-Christian values, the entire system will collapse. I cannot tell you how many videos I saw back in 2017, 2018 about the fall of the West, the fall of the West. Now, a lot of that content was about immigration, but a lot of it was about America becoming more secular and not as religious as it was a decade or two ago. So I think these people feel that like they become disillusioned with the idea of separation of church and state. And they believe now that if you want America to maintain its vigor, its energy, you need to have the church come in to resolve everything. And you see that this plays into conservatism. You see that people who are more conservative tend to like the idea of having a strong leader come in and take charge of everything. And for them, that strong man was Donald Trump.
And kind of wrap up a little bit here. When it comes to, the relationship that, these narratives have around Trump, it seems to me that Donald Trump, despite many of his character flaws and problems, Republicans and really Christian nationalists in general didn't really care so much about his actual godliness. They cared what he was doing to their enemies. And really the rejection of pluralism seems to be critical there. It's not just the conspiracism, the prejudice, all of which are incredibly important, but there is, I think, fundamentally a breakdown where they don't see the restraint anymore as a good thing. They see going all out, defeating their enemies through any mechanism necessary to be the best way forward. And with that in mind, if the current trend continues with, Christian nationalists becoming more and more bold, do you think American democracy can survive that? Or do you think America would have to undergo a serious shift, an opposition to end that trend?
I do not think that if you look at the narrative of these like so-called Christian nationalists out there, it is abundantly clear that if they were ever to gain a position of power, democracy as we know it in this country would disappear. I mean, like we've watched the Jan 6 hearings play out, and it is so apparent that these are people who have zero respect for democracy. And hypothetically, if they would have succeeded on Jan 6, they would make democracy extinct in this country, which is why it is so important for everybody who has any interest in trying to undo democracy and who is peddling these conspiracy theories about like the election being fraudulent. They need to become politically irrelevant. Because I know it's kind of a cliche, but I look at a lot of the messaging happening right now, and I do think back to what happened in 1930s Germany, where you saw this environment of conspiratorial thinking play into itself, and we saw the rhetoric ramp up further and further to the point where people no longer felt the need to play nicely. They were more than happy to break the rules and the formalities of politics in order to achieve their end goal. So I guess the way that I can end this is by saying keep calling these people out, keep calling out people that were involved in Jan 6, and do make sure that you go out and vote this November. Otherwise, if these people gain power, they're not going to let go of it easily.
No, and they're almost certainly going to do everything in their power to ensure that power remains permanently with them. But I'd like to thank you for joining me. I know this conversation can get a little heavy because of some of the narratives surrounding what constitutes Christianity, what constitutes freedom of religion, but you feel free to come back on the show, and I look forward to speaking with you more in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Connor.
Thank you very much for listening. I really enjoy these kinds of podcasts and really these discussion formats, mostly because you can go off the cuff with some of these people, even when things don't go according to plan. That said, I'm looking forward to having another guest on soon, 2 weeks from today, where I will be discussing the midterm elections. You can find out about the announcement and the plan for that on my website at progressive-american.com, or you can check out my Twitter at Connor_politics. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.